everyone! Welcome back! Today we are going to learn a lot about our respiratory system. Are you ready? Let's get into it. For everyone's information, our respiratory system consists of two parts, the respiratory and the conducting part. Our respiratory part includes the lungs, and our conducting part of the respiratory system includes the nasal cavities, the pharynx, the trachea, the bronchi, the larynx, and all the intrapulmonary continuations therein. Now on your screen you are seeing the respiratory system parts. In this activity, you are going to complete the gaps with the correct organ name. Can you do it? I'm excited! Let's do it! I'll give you 5 seconds to answer all the 6 gaps therein. Now, when I say go, the timer will start. Alright? Ready? Go! Alright, time's up for now, everyone. Let's see if you got all the 6 correct answers. Now, in our respiratory system part picture, we can see the nasal cavity, the larynx, the trachea, the lung, the bronchi, and the diaphragm. So, how much score did you get? Very good! That's a good score. To start off our lesson today, we are going to learn the common features of air passages. You are seeing the picture, the histological feature of an air passage. The interior of the passage is lined over most of its extent by pseudostratified, ciliated, and columnar epithelium. The epithelium is kept moist by the secretions of numerous serous glands. Now this mucus, along with the dust particles in it, is constantly moved toward the pharynx by action of... Correct! Cilia. When excessive mucus accumulates, it is brought out by coughing or is swallowed. Deep to the mucosa, there are numerous blood vessels that serve to warm the inspired air. Next is our nasal cavity. Histologically, the wall of each half of the nasal cavity is divisible into 3 distinct regions. One is the vestibule, next is the olfactory mucosa, and the respiratory mucosa. The vestibule is the interior or the anterior dilated part of the nasal cavity. The vestibule is lined by skin continuous with that on the exterior of the nose. So hair and sebaceous glands are present in this area. Next is the olfactory mucosa. The olfactory mucosa is responsible for the sense of smell. It consists of a lining epithelium and a lamina propria. Lastly, our olfactory epithelium, the last or the third of the 3 distinct regions of our nasal cavity. Our olfactory epithelium is pseudostratified histologically, and it is much thicker than the epithelium lining the respiratory mucosa. Using special methods, 3 types of cells can be recognized in the epithelium. The olfactory cells are modified neurons, and there are 2 processes, the distal and proximal, arise from the central part. The distal part, representing the dendrite, passes towards the surface of olfactory epithelium. It ends in a thickening called the rod or knob, from which a number of non-motile olfactory cilia arise and project into a layer of fluid covering the epithelium. The proximal process of each olfactory cell represents the axon. It passes into the subjacent connective tissue where it forms one fiber of the olfactory nerve. Second is the sustentacular cells. The sustentacular cells support the olfactory cells. Lastly, the basal cells, which divide to form new olfactory cells to replace those that die. Also here in our nasal cavity, the goblet cells. As we know, they are flask-shaped cells that are scattered in the epithelium to produce mucus. That's right. So non-ciliated columnar cells with microvilli on the face surface probably secrete a serous fluids that keeps the mucosa moist. So the basal cells lying near the basal lamina probably give rise to ciliated cells to replace those that lost or those that died. The lamina propria of the nasal mucosa contains lymphocytes, plasma cells, macrophages, and few neutrophils and eosinophils. Eosinophils increase greatly in number when the person is suffering from allergic rhinitis. So your eosinophil count increases greatly when you have allergic rhinitis. That's all for our nasal cavity discussion. Let's move on to our larynx. The larynx is a specialized organ responsible for the production of voice, just like mine today. It houses the vocal cords. The wall of the larynx has a complete structure made up of a number of cartilages, membranes, and muscles. Next is our pharynx. The pharynx consists of nasal, oral, and laryngeal parts. The nasal part of our pharynx is purely respiratory in function, but the oral and laryngeal part are more intimately concerned with the alimentary system, and the wall of the pharynx is fibromuscular in nature. The connective tissue subjacent to the epithelial lining of our vocal folds is devoid of lymph vessels. This factor slows down the lymphatic spread of cancer arising in the epithelium of the vocal folds. Now let's talk about the respiratory part of our respiratory system, which includes the lungs. The lungs are in charge of supplying the body with fresh air. So by contracting its muscles during inhalation, the diaphragm assists in pushing air into the lungs, relaxing forces of air out. As soon as air enters the lungs through the mouth and nose, with the aid of mucus, which prevents dust and other particles from entering with the air, it passes through the trachea and into the bronchi, where it fills up the alveoli. Air then moves to the blood vessels encircling the alveoli from there. The carbon dioxide is expelled by the red blood cells and then exchange it for oxygen, which binds to hemoglobin molecules. Through the body, the blood is pumped with oxygen. The lungs exhale out carbon dioxide and additional gases that the body does not require. Next is our alveoli. By definition or by function, the alveoli is responsible for the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide through the respiratory membrane. The alveolar cells, which are also called pneumocytes, are cells lining the alveoli of the lungs. There are 3 types of alveolar cells that exist, but only 2 of these are given attention. But according to other sources, there are actually 3 types of alveolar cells. Anyway, guys, the 2 types of alveolar cells that are focused by our module histology that exist are type 1 alveolar cells and the type 2 alveolar cells. The type 1 alveolar cells are squamous and cover approximately 90 to 95% of the alveolar surface. Type 1 cells are involved in the process of gas exchange between the alveoli and the blood. Now, the type 2 alveolar cells are covered in small fraction of the alveolar surface area. Their function is of major importance in the secretion of pulmonary surfactant, which decreases the surface tension within the alveoli. And the third cell type, the alveolar brush or type 3 pneumocyte cells, has also been described to form part of the alveolar lining. These cells are sparse but are easily distinguished from other epithelial cells by the presence of a tuft or blunt squamous microvilli on the cell surface. Alright everyone, we are now at the highlight of our respiratory system discussion, which includes the deoxygenated blood and the oxygenated blood flow in our lungs. So the lungs receive the oxygenated blood from the right ventricle of the heart through pulmonary arteries. And within the lungs, the arteries end in an extensive capillary network of the walls of alveoli. And the blood oxygenated here is returned to the left atrium of the heart through pulmonary veins. So oxygenated blood required for nutrition of the lung itself reaches the lungs through bronchial arteries. They are distributed to the walls of bronchi as far as the respiratory bronchioles. Blood reaching the lung through these arteries is returned to the heart partly through bronchial veins and partly through the pulmonary veins. So that's a wrap for our discussion about the respiratory system, and I thank you everyone for joining and participating in our discussion today, and I hope you have the most wonderful rest of the day. Thank you, and until next time.